Welcome, everyone. Welcome to SF Bay Area School Counselors and Educational Professionals Meetup Group. I would like to welcome our speaker, Lois Letchford, and her talk, The 3 E's of Education: Experience, Emotion, and Expertise. Our meetup group is sponsored by CounselHero. CounselHero is trying to change the school and college counseling as we know it by building a complete end-to-end system that automates many of the tasks counselors are asked to do in schools. This will free up counselors to spend more time with their students and impact their lives. One counselor in a school can have as many as 1,000 cases of students, but CounselHero makes it possible to serve all these with a combination of AI and social emotional learning tests. So go check it out at counselhero.com. Lois Letchford sees reading instruction as a dynamic quest to meet the complex needs of students, aiming to have as many students on the path to become what she calls skilled readers. Today's talk will cover her mindset and challenges she overcame in an educational setting to achieve dynamic results. Letchford graduated from an Australian College of Education and went to get a master's degree in literacy and learning from University of Albany. She has published a memoir titled Reversed and has worked as an author and speaker for over 6 years now. We are very excited to have her, and please now give your full attention to Lois Letchford. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't see anyone, so I'm talking to a screen at the moment. So I'm delighted to be here and delighted to share my story with you. The original topic I had chosen was about telling stories, but I wanted it to be far more impactful than just telling a story. So I changed it to the 3 E's of education. And now that's what you'll be hearing about tonight. So why listen to me? I'm an author of the book Reversed to Memoir, but I have specialized in teaching the most vulnerable children to read. My first student was 7 and called terrible names, and you'll hear about that one tonight. My next student was 13 years old and had spent 4 years in a phonics-only reading program, only to come out non-reading. I need the timer. I taught him to read simply by knowing what to do, knowing what I had to do, and through engagement. Engagement was critical, but it's only been in the last few years that I've been able to put the brain research onto it. Time now. Okay, so that's why you're listening to me. Vulnerable students, students who have been left behind in the classroom. No, just the time. So let's focus on what we're doing today, which is talking about expertise, experience, and emotion. I just want to get to know the time so I don't run out of time in the end. In a classroom today, we talk about expertise, the skill of reading and writing. That's what we test. That's what we teach. What about experience? What about emotion? And in this talk, I'm looking at expertise being reading and writing. On the top of the diagram, we're talking about hyperlexia, which is the ability to just read words, continuously read words without meaning. Dyslexia on the other end is a student's struggle with reading. So how are all these 3 going to work together to produce skilled readers? And as we start, I've got some questions for you. You don't have to answer them yet, but I want you to think about them. I'm going to provide some data, and I want you to think, what would you be telling parents? What educational options would be available to this student? And what educational outcomes would you predict? Think about those questions as we go through the whole presentation. They'll come up again at the end. This is piece of data number 1. It's a performance task of a child who is 6.5 years old. As you can see, there are 2 within the average and the remainder are below average. The second piece of data belongs to the same child, and it's a verbal performance task. He's got one average result and the remainder are below average. And the questions again, what would you be telling the parents? What educational options would be available? And what outcomes would you predict for this child? Data piece number 1. And I've got a second piece of data for you. And this is a speech language result. And this child was 11 years and 5 months old. And the beginning is the auditory number memory that you're asking for. And auditory number memory is simply for a child to repeat the numbers that the tester has given. And then the second one reversed is to repeat the numbers the tester has provided in reverse. Auditory sentence memory, can they repeat accurately the sentence they've been given? An auditory word memory is, can they repeat a number of words? And I go by percentile rank. Many of you will be much more familiar with these tests, but the percentile rank is down in the 2nd and 3rd percent. Auditory word discrimination, and I can't see the results anymore. Auditory word discrimination places him somewhere, I've forgotten the percentage. And auditory processing overall, this child is on the 2nd percentile, chronological age 11 years and 5 months, and auditory perceptual age of about 5 years and 10 months. So, what would you be telling the parents? What educational options would you suggest? And what outcomes would you predict? Have a think about it for just a minute. Because I'm here to tell you a story. And this story began in 1994 when this young boy, Nicholas, went to school. He was aware that he may not have understood the teacher, but he knew he still had to go to school. He bit his fingernails, he wet his pants, and the teacher said he stared into space most of the day. He had very few friends. In fact, that's wrong. He had no friends, and he was socially isolated, both in the classroom and at the lunch hour. Then how do we go about things from here? We go a testing. And the testing said, the testing shows that he can read 10 words, that he has no strengths, and above all, he's got a low IQ. And if that's not enough to put a child into a really damaging basket, the school diagnostician then said, well, he's the worst child I've seen in 20 years of teaching. So I'm asked to take this young boy on. And I go with standardized books, standardized ideals on how we have to teach reading. And the name of the book was Success for All. Nothing could have been further from the truth, as the little boy had no memory, or appeared to have no memory for letters, let alone sounds, and let alone be able to put them all together to create words, because there were isolated words on the page, there were no pictures, and he was required to sound out a word, put those sounds together to create something. And he couldn't do it. So I had to start thinking, what strengths does he have? How do we go through this? What do we have to do? And I remember working with him, and he had 2 strengths. One was to see patterns, and the second was to rhyme words. And with that success, I simply thought, what can I do? And you've got a blank slate because he cannot do anything else. I thought I will write a poem for him. The poetry and the poetry writing success was instant, because I did not expect him to read anything. I read to him. He joined in. We repeated the rhyme and repeated the rhyme. We found the rhyming words. We acted it out. We repeated it again, and eventually he then illustrates the poem. And one poem led to the next and the next and the next, because you go with success. And success was critical. Decoding did come into play, and I found a way to teach decoding. And I do it, and I'm just giving you one example of what I did and what I do with all of my students. And I do it through the OC family, and I put things into a shoebox because it makes it easy and keeps everything together. And then we have word puzzles with the rhyming words of all the OC rhyming words: rock, lock, flock, block, and shock. And with this lot, I even added an ing. And then inside the box goes the objects of a rocking chair, a rock, a lock, a block, and a sock. So students are no longer thinking about pictures, they've actually got actual objects to work with. Then I'm asking them to read and do. And the first thing they have to do is find the block. And then place the block on the table. So it's very simple at the beginning. Find the rock. And then it's the placement words. Put the rock on the block. And you can change this, but these are things that are taught in preschool usually. And the next one is a change, because it's, can you block the hole in the box with the sock? The word block has now moved from being a noun to a verb. And can my students do it? Because even you have to read it accurately. Can you do what? Block the hole, where? The hole in the box, what with the sock? And the final one that I'm giving you today is block the doorway. And my students now are totally confused because they see a block on the table and they look at the doorway and they look at the block and they look at the doorway and have not made the switch that I have to do something else. That confusion is a positive thing, because I just keep repeating, block the doorway, block the door, until someone goes, oh, I know what I have to do. I have to block the doorway. And then do they block the doorway, stand in front of it? When someone comes through it, they still walk through? So you want complete comprehension of what is going on with this simple sentence. So they're not only reading words, but reading and comprehending, and reading and comprehending the multiple meaning of words. Today, my students have left my classroom as skilled readers, as did that young boy in the beginning. That was the start. We've got the poetry going on, we've got the decoding come along, and then the poetry took a complete new turn as the double O comes up in the words. And I wrote this poem about Captain Cook, the last of the great explorers. You know, Captain Cook had a notion there's a gap in the map in the great big ocean. He took a look without the help of any book, hoping to find a quiet little nook. And as we're doing this, we had no maps at the time. I'm just reading it and reading it and reading it, and it's all falling a bit flat. He's not comprehending, but he's reading it with me and reading it with me. And then we happen to discover a map coming from, printed in 1550. And this illustration caused curiosity and a total change in our learning, because we'd been working on this, and the young boy Nicholas said to me, who came before Captain Cook? And I said, well, that was easy. That was Christopher Columbus. And he said, and who came before Columbus? Now we're tapping into inquiry. And I had not even thought about who had come before Columbus. So here you have this child with supposed low IQ, questioning way beyond expectation. He became, whoops, I've done this again. Go back. I can't do it. The success of maps came through experience. The experience is tied to emotion, and the emotion brought expertise. Now I'm going to stop the story there, because I want to share with you the ending of the story and then examine this story from a really long lens.
When my son was 6 years old, he failed first grade and couldn't read. Usually students have 1,000 words. He could read 10 words, and we were told that he has a low IQ. You can't do anything. The child is slow. I decided to take Nicholas on myself. I'm going to try it at home and work from home. I had these books called Successful Phonics-Based Decoding, and it was a disaster. I made learning fun. You throw away what he can't do. Once we got that, you have a different child.
For the degree Doctor of Philosophy, Christchurch, Lois Letchford.
I'm graduating from the University of Oxford with a DPhil in Applied Mathematics.
I became the reading specialist teaching children who had failed the reading programs.
As opposed to focusing on the weaknesses, capitalising on strengths. I wouldn't have got to Oxford if it wasn't because of my dreams and aspirations.
Labelling is the worst thing we do to children. Believe in your child, then they can achieve whatever they like.
So, as you may have gathered, that was my son who failed first grade and who went on to achieve a PhD. And it's through a long lens that I want to examine this story, because it's taken me a long time to be able to give the presentation that I'm giving tonight. And what happened was, after Nicholas graduated, I thought, now's the time I can talk to him about what happened in school. You know, he's confident, he's articulate, he can talk on any subject. He's slow with his speech, but he can talk on anything. And I said to him, Nicholas, tell me what happened in first grade. And my son cried. The tears just ran down his face, and his tongue went round and round in his mouth, and not one word emerged. And that was when I recognized the trauma from that first grade is still there. It hasn't been touched. No one has even talked about it. And he can't say a thing. He can't say anything. That was a traumatic experience. And I thought, I can't even deal with that. I don't have the skills. I don't know anything about it, but we will have to deal with that one day. And then I said, Nicholas, tell me then what happened when you and I learned together. And it was like we flipped a switch in his brain, and his face lit up and he laughed and he said, oh, I remember the poems. I remember the mug and the bug and the cat in the hat and the windmill on the hill. He remembered all of those things. And he said, of course, I remember the mapping. The mapping gave me a love of learning, and I never want to stop learning. Learning just became so much fun and so important then. And the next thing he did was he started to giggle. And it was a 7-year-old. And he said, and I remember you wrote a poem about a witch's spell. And now he's just laughing. He's laughing like he's back in 7 years old again. It's fascinating to me. If you read my book, Reversed, you will not find anything about a witch's spell, because I did not recognize the power. Because Nicholas said, I remember writing the ingredients for the witch's spell. And it was just so funny. And he's laughing, and he can't stop laughing because it was so funny. It was also powerful. And here's me, when I wrote the book, I chose to leave that out because the poem was not good enough. It didn't rhyme properly. There wasn't the right rhythm. But as far as Nicholas was concerned, that was one of the most powerful components of the learning that we did. The emotions that he connected with learning were on the high list, and that's what he remembered. So I had the poetry going on. We had the illustrations. We had tapped into his curiosity and his imagination, and that's where the change occurred. And if you're expecting something about literacy and early literacy, you won't hear tonight from me structured literacy, more phonics instruction, or more phonemic awareness instruction, because although those things are important and foundational in learning to read, they are not the only components. And there has to be a bed for structured literacy, for phonics, and for phonemic awareness. And recently, now, if you haven't come across this person, I suggest you Google her and read every academic paper she has, because she's talking about feelings and emotion and learning. And Mary Helen Immordino-Yang says emotions drive not just our desire to solve a problem, but also the access to the memory that allows us to make sense of the problem. I had to see Nicholas's reaction 20-something years after the event to recognize the power of emotions and learning for me to do this talk tonight. We think of literacy as learning of letters and sounds. That's one component. We cannot ignore the experience, and experience changes the brain, or the emotions that are tied to the brain. And Mary Helen has done a huge amount of work on the brain and emotions and learning. Look out for her work. She's done a TED Talk, lots to read. So where does the problem lie? And this becomes my philosophy, that learning and learning problems dwell in activities and cultural practices. And it's a quote from Professor Kurt Dudley-Marling. We are the ones in charge of the teaching. We are the ones who are required to change the teaching practices and make them culturally appropriate. And the last part of this sentence is, rather than the heads of individual students, I'm starting to question that. Because as you see tonight with that component of decoding, children see the world concretely. So they don't always see it the way everyone else sees it. They'll see block as only the block and not realize that it has multiple meanings. And again, it goes back to, how are we teaching? Or are we just blaming the child? But if we understand children, particularly those on the autism spectrum, see the world concretely, it gives us an option to say, what else do I have to do? And this, I'm not a brain researcher. However, we see the physical attributes of what's going on in the brain. When Nicholas was in first grade, he was in fight and flight mode. He was unable to do anything in the classroom. And what I failed to mention, and what the teacher did not tell me in grade 1, was that she shouted at him every day of the year. He could not function. It was literally survival. He could not dress himself for school. He was flat out putting his lunch in his lunchbox. And even going into the classroom was just simply survival mechanism. And he's asking, am I safe? And he's saying, no, I'm not safe. And the brain could not function. When we moved and I started to teach him and started to write poems, he was able to relax and say, am I loved? And you see the brain's reaction through physiology of the body, muscle tension, stretching, clamming up is crying and stress. Once they relax, the brain also starts to relax. And the last component, what can I learn from this, happened when we were in exploration mode with Captain Cook. And this poem of Cook, I knew engagement was always important, but it was engagement tapping into inquiry, allowing him to ask questions that made the difference. Finding the maps added a whole new layer. We're experiencing maps. We're not just talking about them, but we're going to museums. Today, you'd be looking on the internet and seeing all of the maps that are now available online. So we're experiencing, and when you've got an experience, you have an emotion that's attached to that experience. And that's what you start to remember. And what was most surprising, above all, was that we learned Christopher Columbus's map was latest map was over 1,000 years old. And his map was drawn by a man called Ptolemy in 250 AD in Alexandria. And Ptolemy never left the shores of Alexandria, but he took in information from the sailors and drew the first map of the world. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's moving. It's an emotional experience. It's emotional and it's an experience. And you learn to read and write. The expertise of reading alone comes along with it. When we are in the classrooms, what are we teaching and testing? Are we working only with the expertise of reading and writing, or are we putting it on a bed of emotion and experience? Or are we ignoring those things? For learning to really happen, you must hit the sweet spot, right in the center, the intersection of the Venn diagram. Change the life for Nicholas, change the life for my students. Our brains are plastic. Remember, they are plastic and they aren't set in stone. And they grow. Learning is an experience-dependent process. Remember that. Experiences change the brain. This was Nicholas building when he was 11, showing his strength of spatial awareness. The current approach, how do we teach today? And I've deliberately chosen Mount Everest because one of my students in 4th grade was doing something very similar to this. What are we asking students to do? To read a passage, answer the question, circle the correct answer. It's dealing with only the expertise of reading and writing. My student struggled to read the passage. He could barely answer the questions and he could circle it, but wasn't always the correct answer. If a child cannot comprehend what's going on just by reading more without comprehending, is not going to get us to where we want to go today. So we're only dealing with the expertise. And today, when everything is available at the click of a button, we need to build a background knowledge. And where do we find it? Something like Everest, YouTube's, by reading. And something for me as critical as a physiological or a physical feature, we need maps. Children need to understand where they are on the map. Can they find themselves on a globe? Where do they live? Can they find the city? Can they find the state? Can they find the country? To understand where Tibet is, Nepal is, and where Mount Everest is, let alone what it's like to go up this mountain that is so high. I said I chose Mount Everest for a reason. I look at the word India and I know students have in the past struggled with the difference between India and Indian Ocean, let alone East Indies or West Indies. All of these words have meaning. And again, when we're doing it just on a bed of reading and writing without experience, our children are totally confused and saying, well, I got the answer right. What else does the rest matter? I want depth of knowledge. I want my students to be able to find those places on a map and understand the difference of all that they're going through. Briggs Myers wrote a book, Gifts Differing, in 1980. And she says, what makes learning challenging? And she said, the learning process requires unconscious insights when there's no context for information, it goes into separate and arbitrary facts, hard to understand, impossible to recall, devoid of interest, and takes an inordinate amount of attention to be recalled. Do I say that again? There's no context for information. It goes into separate and arbitrary facts, hard to understand, impossible to recall, and devoid of interest. And it takes an inordinate amount of attention to be learned. That's what's happening when we're only working in the area of expertise. But she goes on and she says, when do we find learning easy? We find it easy when it's relevant, when it's connected, when it's related, and if it's surprising, interesting, or funny. Learning happens with no effort at all. Does this reflect on your learning also? Is that how you find learning too? So I've given myself plenty of time. I'm going back to my 3 questions. And there's one more slide before our 3 questions. The intersection of the Venn diagram, the intersection of experience, of emotion, and expertise is what I'm aiming for to teach my most vulnerable children. I do teach them to decode. I do phonemic awareness instructions, but it's one component of this complex problem that goes across all of teaching. The words in the middle of these come from Brian Camborne's Conditions of Learning. Brian Camborne's an Australian professor who I'll talk about at the end. Conditions of learning that apply from the beginning of learning to read, or beginning to speak actually, to reading, right through to rocket science. Now, my 3 questions. This is where I want some input. What would you be telling parents? We're going back to the original data points. What would you be telling parents about that child? What educational options would be available? And what outcomes would you predict? Would you like to, I'll put the data up on the board. Would you like to answer in the chat? Where do you think? Let's do question 1. What would you be telling parents? Any comments? No one's talking to me. Can you talk to me? Can you write in the chat? What would you be telling parents? No one's talking to me. What educational options would be available? Can anyone see this? What options would be available? Are there standardized reading programs? Are there speech therapists? What else would be available?
You can write them on the chat.
Yes, you can write them on the chat. Yes, yeah. Please write them on the chat. No one's writing. And what educational outcomes would you predict for a child who's got this sort of profile at 1st grade? Ah, fantastic. Hands-on learning. Yes. What outcomes would you think would happen? Performance task and verbal task. Are we afraid to say anything? Or is this too difficult? Inez, do you want to answer? No. Because this piece of data actually belongs to this boy, to my son, Lois Letchford. That was his result from 1st grade. And no one expected much of him in 1st grade, but it was an extraordinary journey for him to achieve. Lots of talking, fantastic, lots of talking, lots of language learning. Exactly, and that's where the poetry became so critical for his learning, because it gave him the language that we needed, and the poetry lined his brain with language. and it was remembered for a long period of time. And what about this piece of data, the speech language data? Any ideas, any thoughts? What would you expect? Where do you think he would end up? Or don't we want to make that prediction? Would he last in school? No one's talking to me. That's disappointing. Because, again, this piece of data belongs to Lois Letchford. And what was fascinating about this data was that Nicholas was 11 and a half years old when this was done. He's reading and writing effectively in the classroom. Perfect. It's too early to make predictions about what will be done. Exactly. It is far too early. But if we don't do something and change the teaching, we end up going down the tube. Nicholas was reading and writing effectively when this test was done. And it was all because we changed the teaching early on so that he could cope in the classroom and eventually fly. That is, you are just fantastic. You give lots of opportunity to build the strengths and find the areas of passion, which is what we had to do. And it allowed him then to fly. If you like, read the whole story, because I've given this to you in a 30-minute time slot and just a snapshot. But speaking to Nicholas in 2018 really helped me put into perspective the power of experience and tied with that emotion, which I hadn't understood and I hadn't expected. My way of saying it would have been engagement. And engagement for all children is critical, but it's also experience and emotion. If you buy a copy of the book, read it. Please leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads and share it with educators. And Professor Jo Bowler from Stanford University uses our story in her book, Limitless Minds. You need additional information. Check out a couple of these videos. The first one is Deborah Couch and Brian Camborne talking to Dr. Sambo Marito. Brian Camborne started his teaching experience in 1956. He's published everywhere. He's well known in the world of learning and literacy. And he's repeating the conditions of learning. There's a number of academic papers around on the conditions of learning and on the conditions of learning as applied to early literacy too. So that's a fantastic broadcast. The second one is talking to Andrea Samadi, talking to Mary Helen Immordino-Yang on the neuroscience of learning and the power of engaging emotions. Why do we test expertise alone? Because it's easy to do. What's harder to do is look at the experience, and the emotion's impossible, isn't it? And it's harder to quantify. But Mary Helen talks about the power of emotions, and I've read a number of her papers on we think, we feel. And one more. This is another podcast, and it comes from Dope Downs is talking to Professor Pamela Snow. Pam Snow and Brian Campbell are both Australian. Pamela Snow is a speech language pathologist, so she understands the foundations of language and literacy. And in this video, she gives an excellent account of all that is required for children to learn to decode with ease. And when I was teaching Nicholas and teaching my other students, I have to fill in so many gaps and do so much work in the language and literacy area alongside teaching of decoding and phonemic awareness, which is why I say again and again, you won't hear me say structured literacy instruction, because I'm dealing with experience. I'm building their experience, tying the language to the experience, and making sure my students are engaged and happy and learning and creating pictures from words and understanding multiple meaning of words, understanding how pronouns work, understanding the language, which we all tend to just take for granted. Okay, And remember, emotions are the energy in motion. They can move us toward learning or away from it. And as adults, I'm sure you can all identify somewhere in your learning where learning was great fun. At other times, it was a struggle. Steve Lane wrote a review for my book, and he said, this was written for all true teachers of the world. I laughed and I cried. My book starts, it's quite sad, as you follow Nicholas through the first year of school and just watch him fail. And me as a parent writing it, it moved me to tears on numerous occasions. So please enjoy, take it away, because there's so much to learn about mindset. Mindset, what we think of children and how we think impacts our teaching. So, have you got any questions? How do I go from here? Ines, do you take over? Any comments, thoughts, questions? Stop share. Hello. Inez, any comments, any thoughts? Can we have other cameras?
Sorry, Louise, I think there was a problem with my internet.
Did it drop out?
I think I did. Can you hear me right now?
I can hear you, yes.
Perfect. So if anyone can, if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to share it on chat.
I appreciate what you wrote in the chat, Inez. I'm sure that's you. You know, but
they shared it with me. The audience shared it with me.
Sorry?
So the audience shared it with me. I shared it with you.
Ah, perfect. Thank you. Yes, yes, yes. And I love that, you know, it's too early to make predictions about what they'll be doing when they're older, because often they do. And that's what the diagnostician said, you know, he's the worst child I've seen in 20 years of teaching. She had made a prediction. This child will not survive, basically, is what she was saying. But those words really gave me a fire that one wouldn't expect.
Yes. It seems there's no question. So thank you all for attending this talk, and thank you, Louise, for your time. SF Bay Area school counselors and educational professionals hold these talks to inform you on the latest news in our field and keep everyone furthering their learning. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Can I say one more thing before we stop?
Sure.
I struggled with reading in school myself, which was fascinating, and I grew up reading words I couldn't comprehend. So it allows me to look at literature from a different viewpoint. And because of that, I now today had an academic paper accepted into the reading teacher. So we're waiting for that to be published. So I had to do it by connecting with Professor Tim Rosinski, and I am just waiting for that to come out, and it's been called a seminal paper on text integration.
Perfect.
And that hasn't been done since 1985, and I am just over the moon that I've been able to share that with you. So look out for it in the reading teacher.
Great. We loved it.
Yes, yes. So it's great fun. So thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm sorry I didn't get to see more chats. I had wanted to involve the audience. I didn't want to just talk. But thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, Louise. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this show. We are organizing lots of these events. You can check our meetup group, check our website to learn more about it. Have a nice rest of your day.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.